The words hit me like ice water as I stood frozen behind the fence, clutching the warm casserole dish against my chest. Why is he even still alive? My own son's voice, cold and sharp, cutting through the evening air. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to pretend I never heard those words, but my feet stayed planted on the grass. I didn't leave. I listened. What my son didn't know was that his father would make him regret every single word he spoke that night. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The casserole dish burned through my oven mitts as I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. Victoria's recipe, the one she'd taught Alan when he was 12, back when his eyes still lit up at the smell of her cooking. Now those same hands that once helped her measure flour were gesturing dismissively through the kitchen window. The old man's been hanging on for what, 10 years since Mom died? Alan's voice carried that particular edge I'd been hearing more often lately. I mean, what's the point? He just sits in that house, wasting away. I pressed closer to the fence, the rough wood catching on my jacket. Through the gap between the slats, I could see my son pacing around his granite kitchen island, a beer bottle dangling from his fingers. Jake Mitchell sat across from him, nodding along like some sort of overpaid bobblehead. The same Jake who'd been calling me Uncle Lucas for the past 5 years. "Look, Alan, I get it," Jake said, pulling out a manila folder thick with papers. "But legally, there are ways to handle this, ways that don't involve waiting for nature to take its course." The folder hit the counter with a slap that made me flinch. Alan leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that made my stomach turn. It was the same calculating look he'd worn as a teenager when he'd convinced his mother to let him have the car keys, knowing full well he'd already dented the bumper. "Tell me more about this incompetency thing," Alan said, his voice dropping to a whisper I had to strain to hear. Jake spread the papers across the island like he was dealing cards. "Adult guardianship. We file a petition claiming your father can no longer make sound decisions about his finances or health care. Get him declared mentally incompetent, and boom, you become his legal guardian. Full control of his assets." My fingers went numb around the casserole dish. The warmth I'd felt carrying Victoria's recipe over here was seeping away, replaced by something cold and hollow in my chest. Alan was studying those papers with the same intensity he'd once reserved for baseball cards. "How long does it take?" Alan asked. 6 to 8 weeks if we do it right. I know a guy, Dr. Harrison, who'll back up our claims about his mental state. Old Lucas probably won't even know what's happening until it's too late." Alan laughed, and the sound was nothing like the boy who used to giggle when I pushed him on the tire swing in our backyard. "Perfect. And then? Then you can make all the decisions. Sell his house, move him into assisted living, liquidate his investments." Jake tapped the papers with his pen. "Your inheritance becomes your, let's call it, an advance." I wanted to burst through that fence, to grab my son by the shoulders and shake him until the boy I'd raised came back. Instead, I stood there like a fool, holding a casserole that would never be eaten, listening to my own flesh and blood plot my downfall. What about the neighbors? Mrs. Henderson next door, she's always checking on him. "Concerned son worried about his aging father's welfare," Jake said smoothly. "We spin it as protection, not exploitation. Besides, once the paperwork goes through, what anyone thinks won't matter." Alan drained his beer and set the bottle down hard enough to echo through the kitchen. "When do we start?" "I can file the initial petition Monday, but Alan," Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower, "once we do this, there's no going back." "Are you sure you're ready to cross that line?" My son, my boy, the one I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with algebra homework, looked Jake straight in the eye and smiled. "Dad made his choice when he decided to stick around this long. I'm just helping him make the next one." The casserole dish slipped from my hands, landing in the soft grass with a muffled thud. Neither of them heard it over their laughter, but I felt something inside me crack, not break, crack, like ice under pressure, still holding together but fundamentally changed. I bent down and picked up Victoria's casserole, brushing off the bits of grass and dirt. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. Steady like they'd been during my 25 years on the police force, back when I was Detective Lucas Thompson instead of just Dad. Alan had no idea what he'd just awakened. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Victoria's old rocking chair, staring at the manila envelope I'd pulled from my bedroom safe. 25 years on the police force, and I'd kept every contact, every favor owed, every piece of leverage I'd ever earned. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities I'd hoped never to use on family. The next morning, I heated up the grass-stained casserole and drove back to Alan's house. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to leave marks, but I kept my face neutral. 25 years of questioning suspects had taught me the value of a poker face. Alan answered the door in his bathrobe, hair still messy from sleep. For a split second, he looked like the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. Then he saw the casserole dish, and his expression shifted into something that might have passed for warmth if you didn't know what to look for. "Dad!" What a surprise. He stepped aside, but not before I caught him glancing at his Rolex. Even at 9 in the morning, he was counting minutes. Come in, come in." His kitchen still smelled like expensive cologne and stale beer. The manila folder was gone, but I could see the corner of Jake's business card peeking out from under a stack of mail. I set the casserole on his granite counter and watched him notice the grass stains. "What happened here?" he asked, running his finger along the edge of the dish. "Clumsy old hands," I said, letting my voice waver just slightly. "Dropped it in the yard. Good thing your mother made these dishes sturdy." I watched his face carefully. Most people would have asked if I was hurt. Alan just nodded and moved to the coffee maker. "So what brings you by, Dad? Is everything okay?" He poured himself a cup, but didn't offer me one. Another small test failed. I pulled out one of Victoria's old photo albums from my bag, the leather cover worn soft from years of handling. I was looking through some of Mom's things last night. Found this. I opened it to a picture of Alan at 8 years old, flower in his hair, standing on a step stool next to Victoria as she taught him to make her famous casserole. Alan glanced at the photo, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone screen. 3 text messages had come in since I'd arrived. "That's nice, Dad. Mom was always good with the cooking." I turned the page slowly, deliberately. Another photo, Alan's high school graduation. Victoria weak from chemo, but beaming with pride. "She was so proud of you." "Talk about you right up until the end." I paused, watching him scroll through his messages. "Said you'd promise to take care of me when she was gone." His thumb stopped moving. For just a moment, his shoulders tensed. "Of course, Dad. You know I'm always here for you." "That's good to hear." I closed the album and slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. "Because I've been thinking about making some changes. Financial planning, you know, making sure everything's in order." Alan's hand moved toward the paper like it was magnetized. I'd seen the same hungry grab in interrogation rooms when suspects thought they were about to get a deal. He unfolded it, and I watched his pupils dilate as he read the letterhead. Thompson Family Trust, Asset Summary. The numbers on that page were real. Every penny I'd saved over 3 decades, every investment Victoria and I had made together. $2.4 million in assets, all listed in neat columns that made Alan's breathing change from steady to shallow. "Dad, this is quite a portfolio." His voice had dropped to the tone he'd used as a teenager when he wanted something expensive. "Have you thought about, at your age, maybe you should consider having someone help you manage this?" I let him think he was leading the conversation. "What do you mean?" "Well, financial management can be complicated. Lots of decisions to make, paperwork to keep track of." He folded the paper carefully, like he was handling gold leaf. "Maybe you should think about giving someone power of attorney, someone you trust." The coffee maker gurgled between us, filling the silence. I watched Alan's face cycle through emotions: excitement, calculation, impatience. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "I appreciate the concern, son, but I'm not quite ready for that yet." I reached for the paper, and Alan's grip tightened for just a second before he let go. "Though I suppose I should start thinking about the future." "You should, Dad. I mean, what if something happened to you? What if you got sick, or—" He caught himself before he said what he was really thinking. "I just want to make sure you're protected." I stood up slowly, making a show of checking my watch with fumbling fingers. "Well, I should let you get on with your day. Thanks for listening to an old man ramble." Alan walked me to the door, and I felt his eyes on my back the whole way. As I reached for the handle, he put his hand on my shoulder. "Dad, that financial stuff we talked about? Maybe we should discuss it more seriously. Soon." The boy who'd cried when his goldfish died was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes held the same cold calculation I'd seen in white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than everyone else. "Soon," I agreed. "Very soon." I drove home with the asset summary on my passenger seat and Alan's business card in my pocket, the one he'd slipped me while pretending to hug goodbye. "Jake Mitchell, attorney at law." "Call me if you need anything," Alan had whispered. "Anything at all." That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my old partner from the force. The second was to a private investigator who owed me a favor from a case we'd worked together in '97. By midnight, Jake Mitchell was going to find himself with a very interesting new client, one who wanted to gather evidence about a certain son plotting against his father. Alan thought he was playing chess. What he didn't realize was that I'd been playing the long game since before he was born. The phone rang at exactly 6:30 the next morning. I'd been expecting it. "Lucas Thompson?" The voice was crisp, professional. "Detective Marcus Webb, still working cases even after all these years. Speaking. I ran that background check you requested. Your Jake Mitchell has some interesting financial troubles. 3 credit cards maxed out, behind on his mortgage, and get this, he's not even a licensed attorney in this state. Disbarred in California 2 years ago for client fraud." I sat down heavily in Victoria's chair, the morning light filtering through her lace curtains. "And my son doesn't know this?" "Doubt it. Mitchell's been running a pretty convincing scam. Fake letterhead, rented office space, the works. Your boy's being set up by a con man." After I hung up, I pulled out the box I'd been avoiding for 10 years. Victoria's things, the hospital bracelets, medication bottles, and underneath it all, the manila folder I'd hidden from Alan. Bank statements and financial records that didn't match what I thought we had when Victoria died. My hands shook as I spread the papers across the kitchen table. Withdrawal slips, forged signatures, credit applications in Victoria's name that I'd never seen before. Dates that lined up perfectly with Victoria's worst months, when she was too weak to manage her own affairs and had trusted Alan to help with the bills. I'd been a police detective for 25 years. I'd investigated financial crimes, tracked money laundering operations, built cases that put white-collar criminals away for decades. But when it came to my own family, I'd been blind. The sound of my phone buzzing pulled me back to the present. A text from Alan. "Dad, been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe we should meet with my lawyer friend soon. Strike while the iron's hot, you know." While I stared at that message, another memory surfaced. Alan at 25, the year Victoria got worse. He'd just graduated law school but failed the bar exam. Twice. He'd been angry about it, talking about how unfair the system was, how he deserved better. Around the same time, Victoria had started worrying about money. Medical bills piling up, insurance coverage running out. Bills that should have been manageable with our savings. I walked to my bedroom closet and moved aside the box of Christmas decorations Victoria had organized so carefully. Behind it sat my old service weapon in its lockbox, next to the file cabinet I'd brought home when I retired. 25 years of case files, contact lists, and most importantly, surveillance equipment that technically should have been returned to the department. The bank records painted a devastating picture. Over the course of 18 months, Alan had systematically drained Victoria's accounts. Small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there. Money for medical expenses that never made it to doctors. Then larger sums as Victoria got sicker and less able to monitor her finances. $43,000. That's what Victoria's final year of life had cost her, not in medical bills, but in her son's gambling debts and failed business ventures. By noon, I had micro cameras installed in 3 locations around my house and a listening device in my home phone. If Alan was planning to prove I was mentally incompetent, he'd need evidence. I was going to make sure he got plenty, just not the kind he was expecting. The doorbell rang at 2:15. Alan stood on my porch with Jake Mitchell, both of them wearing their most concerned expressions. Alan carried a briefcase that looked expensive enough to make a statement, probably purchased with Victoria's money. "Dad, I hope you don't mind that I brought Jake along. I thought it might be helpful to have a professional perspective on your situation." I shuffled to the door like the old man they expected to see, making sure to leave it chain-locked. "Situation? What situation?" "Your finances, Dad. Your future. We're worried about you." Alan's voice had that patient tone people use with children and the elderly. "Can we come in?" I let them into my living room, noting how Jake's eyes swept the space like he was cataloging assets. They sat on Victoria's sofa, and Alan pulled out a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "We've been doing some research," Alan said, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. "There are some really good assisted living facilities in the area. Places where you could have help with daily activities, medication management, social interaction. I managed just fine on my own." I kept my voice steady, but let my hands tremble slightly as I reached for my coffee cup. Jake spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Thompson, with all due respect, living alone at your age can be dangerous. What if you fell? What if you forgot to take your medication? Your son is just trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" "From yourself, Dad." Alan's mask was slipping just slightly. "You're 74 years old. Yesterday you dropped a casserole in the yard. Last month Mrs. Henderson said she saw you checking your mailbox 3 times in one day." Mrs. Henderson. My neighbor, who'd watched me raise Alan from a baby, who'd brought us meals when Victoria was sick, who would never have said such a thing. Mrs. Henderson said that? I let confusion creep into my voice. "She's concerned about you, Dad. We all are." Alan glanced at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "That's why we think it might be time to make some practical decisions." Legal decisions. Jake pulled out his own set of papers. "Power of attorney documents. Nothing dramatic, just a way to ensure your son can help you manage things if you need it." I stared at the papers without reaching for them. This seems awfully sudden. "Dad, you can't live in denial forever." Alan's patience was wearing thin. His left foot had started bouncing, a tell he'd had since childhood when he was lying. "What happens if you have a medical emergency? What if you can't make decisions for yourself? What if I don't want to make these decisions today?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alan's jaw tightened, and Jake shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. They'd expected an easy mark, a confused old man grateful for their help. "Dad, we're trying to help you here." Alan's voice had lost its artificial warmth. "But if you're not capable of making rational decisions, are you saying I'm not competent to make my own choices? I'm saying maybe it's time to let someone else make the hard choices for you." Alan stood up, towering over me in my chair. "Someone who has your best interests at heart." I looked up at my son, this stranger wearing my boy's face, and let him see just a flicker of the man I used to be. "And who would that someone be, Alan?" He must have caught something in my tone because his confident expression wavered for just a moment. "Your family, Dad. The people who love you." I stood up slowly, using the arm of my chair for support I didn't really need. "I think I need some time to consider this. Maybe you and your friend should leave." Jake was already gathering his papers, but Alan remained standing in my living room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Dad, you're making a mistake. A big mistake. The only mistake I've made," I said quietly, "was not seeing you clearly enough, soon enough." After they left, I sat back down in Victoria's chair and opened her photo album to the last picture she'd taken, Alan's college graduation. She'd been so proud, even though the chemotherapy had made her hands shake too much to hold the camera steady. The photo was slightly blurred, but you could still see the love in her eyes as she looked at our son. She never knew what he'd done with her life savings. Never knew that while she lay dying, worried about leaving me with medical debt, her own son had already spent her final gift to him. Maybe that was a mercy. I picked up my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized 40 years ago. "Marcus? It's Lucas. I need to call in that favor you owe me. All of them." I didn't wait for them to make the next move. On Thursday morning, I followed Alan to Jake's office, a shabby suite above a nail salon that screamed temporary operation, the kind of place con men used when they needed an address that looked legitimate on business cards. I sat in my car across the street, watching through binoculars as Alan climbed the narrow staircase. 40 minutes later, he came back down carrying a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse, the same kind of envelope Jake had been waving around 3 nights ago. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Package delivered. Your boy took the bait. M." Marcus had done his job. The fake psychiatric evaluation forms Jake was carrying made it look like I'd already been examined by Dr. Harrison and found incompetent. All fabricated, of course, but convincing enough to fool someone who wanted to believe. I waited until Alan drove away, then walked up those same stairs. The directory listed J. Mitchell, attorney at law, in cheap plastic letters. I knocked and heard Jake's voice call out, "Come in!" He looked up from his desk with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. That confidence lasted exactly 3 seconds, the time it took him to register my face and realize he was looking at his supposed victim standing very much in control of his faculties. "Mr. Thompson." Jake's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his desk. What are you doing here?" "I thought we should have a conversation." I closed the door behind me and turned the deadbolt. The click echoed in the small room like a gunshot. "About my son. About you. About the interesting business you two have been conducting." Jake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I don't know what you mean." I pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down like I owned the place. "Jake Mitchell, disbarred in California for defrauding clients, currently operating without a license in this state. 3 credit cards maxed out, behind on your mortgage payment, and desperate enough to run cons on grieving widowers." Each fact I recited made Jake sink a little lower in his chair. By the time I finished, he looked like he was trying to disappear into the worn leather upholstery. "You want to know the funny thing about being a police detective for 25 years? I leaned forward, keeping my voice conversational. "You develop a real appreciation for thorough background checks. Look, Mr. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding," I cut him off, "is you thinking I'm some doddering old fool you could manipulate." I pulled out my phone and set it on his desk. "Want to hear something interesting?" I pressed play. Alan's voice filled the room. "The old man's been hanging on for what, 10 years since Mom died? I mean, what's the point?" Jake's face went white as hospital sheets. I stopped the recording and looked at him with the same expression I'd used on suspects who were about to flip on their partners. "You've been recording us?" His voice cracked like a teenager's. "Jake, I've been recording everything since the moment I realized what you two were planning." I stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the street where normal people went about their normal lives. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I can explain. "No need." I turned back to face him. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to call my son and tell him the deal is off. You're going to return whatever money he's already paid you, and then you're going to disappear from our lives." Jake was sweating now, dark patches spreading under his arms despite the office's chill. And if I don't? Then I make some phone calls to people who are very interested in unlicensed attorneys running fraud operations. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. People who carry badges and have arrest warrants. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Finally, Jake reached for his phone with shaking hands. "Alan?" "It's Jake. We have a problem." I couldn't hear Alan's side of the conversation, but I could read Jake's face well enough. Fear, panic, and the dawning realization that he was in much deeper water than he'd expected. "Your father was just here," Jake said, his eyes never leaving mine. "He knows everything." The phone erupted with Alan's voice, loud enough for me to catch fragments. "Impossible. Old fool. How could he?" "Alan, listen to me," Jake said, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't some confused old man. This is someone who's been playing us from the beginning." More shouting from the phone. Jake held it away from his ear and looked at me with something approaching respect. "He wants to talk to you," Jake said finally. I took the phone. "Hello, son?" "Dad." Alan's voice was different now, colder, all pretense of concern stripped away. "I should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "My nose? In my own life?" I laughed, but the sound had sharp edges. "Alan, you've been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent, with a man who isn't even a real lawyer. Did you think I wouldn't find out? You're 74 years old, Dad. How much longer were you planning to stick around anyway?" The casual cruelty in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I'd known what he was, but hearing him say it out loud was something else entirely. "Long enough to make sure you don't get away with this." "Get away with what?" "Looking out for my inheritance, making sure you don't piss away everything Mom and I worked for." "Everything your mother and I worked for." My voice dropped to a whisper. "Everything we built together while you were busy planning how to tear it down. Don't you dare bring Mom into this. She would have wanted me to take care of you. Your mother would have wanted you to take care of me, not take care of my assets." I looked at Jake, who was frantically gathering papers and shoving them into a briefcase. "But we both know this isn't really about taking care of anyone, is it, Alan?" The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice carried a threat I'd never heard from him before. "Dad, you're making a very big mistake. Bigger than you realize. The only mistake I made was thinking there was still some part of the son I raised left in you." I hung up and handed the phone back to Jake, who was now standing behind his desk like it could protect him from what was coming. "Congratulations," I told him. "You just became a witness in a police investigation." Police investigation? Mail fraud? Wire fraud? Conspiracy to commit elder abuse? Operating without a license? I ticked off the charges on my fingers. Should I keep going? Jake's briefcase hit the floor, spilling papers everywhere. "What do you want?" "I want you to disappear. Tonight. Don't call Alan. Don't try to salvage this. Don't even think about coming back to this state." I pulled out a business card and placed it on his desk. "But first, you're going to make a phone call to this number and tell them everything you know about my son's plans." The card read, "Detective Marcus Webb, Financial Crimes Division." Jake stared at the card like it was a poisonous snake. "You're serious? Dead serious?" I walked to the door and turned the deadbolt back. "You have until midnight to make that call. After that, Detective Webb starts looking for you instead of listening to you." I left Jake sitting in his fake office, surrounded by the scattered remains of his con job, and walked back to my car. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, my heart rate normal. 25 years on the police force had taught me to stay calm in crisis situations. But this wasn't a crisis anymore. This was just the beginning. Alan showed up at my house that night like I knew he would. He didn't knock, just used the key I'd given him years ago when Victoria was sick and I'd needed help with her medication. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard the front door open and his footsteps on the hardwood floor. Heavy, angry steps. Nothing like the boy who used to tiptoe down these same stairs on Christmas morning. "Dad?" His voice echoed through the house. "We need to talk." "In here, son." He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and I could see he'd been drinking. His tie was loosened, his usually perfect hair disheveled. His hands hung at his sides, clenched into fists that he was trying to hide. "Jake called me," he said, not moving from the doorway. "Said you threatened him." I offered him a choice. I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Alan." "I'll stand." He leaned against the doorframe, trying to project casual confidence, but his left eye was twitching. Another tell from childhood. "So what's your play here, old man? You think you can scare me off with some recordings and empty threats?" I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my old police badge. I'd retired it 10 years ago, but the leather wallet still carried weight. I set it on the table between us and watched Alan's face change as he read the words, "Police Detective." "Empty threats?" I asked quietly. "Son, I spent 25 years of my life hunting down people exactly like you." Alan pushed off from the doorframe, no longer pretending to be relaxed. "Like me? I'm your son." "Are you?" I opened the manila folder I'd been keeping beside my coffee cup. "Because the son I raised wouldn't have spent your mother's final years stealing her life savings." The color drained from Alan's face like someone had pulled a plug. He took an involuntary step backward, his shoulder hitting the doorframe hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the nearby wall. That's insane. I helped Mom with her bills. You helped yourself to her money." I spread the bank records across the table like a dealer laying out cards. $43,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, forged signatures on credit applications, medical bills that were never medical bills. Alan's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. "You can't prove that." Bank security footage, handwriting analysis, digital forensics on the credit applications you filled out using her information. I tapped one of the statements. "Want to see the casino receipts from the same dates as the largest withdrawals?" "This is impossible." I was helping her. "You were helping yourself to her money while she lay dying, worried about leaving me with debt." I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on his. "While your mother counted every pill to make her pain medication last longer, you were at the blackjack tables losing her retirement savings." Alan stumbled backward into the living room, and I followed him. He collapsed onto Victoria's sofa, the same spot where he'd sat 3 days ago pretending to care about my well-being. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "That's what I've been trying to figure out for 10 years. I sat down across from him, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. At first, I thought it was grief making me paranoid when the numbers didn't add up. "But the evidence doesn't lie, does it, Alan?" His hands were shaking now, gripping the sofa cushions like they were the only things keeping him grounded. "You don't understand. You needed what? Money for your gambling debts? Startup capital for another failed business venture?" I leaned forward. "What was worth stealing from your dying mother? It wasn't supposed to happen like that." The words exploded out of him, and suddenly he was 25 again, caught in a lie about a maxed-out credit card. The investments were supposed to pay off. I was going to put it all back before she noticed. "So, you decided to gamble with her life savings. I had real opportunities. Real chances to make something of myself." His voice cracked on the last word. "But I needed capital, seed money, and Mom's accounts were just sitting there while she was too sick to monitor them. Too sick to monitor them because she was dying while trusting you to help her manage her affairs." I didn't know she was going to die so quickly. Alan was crying now, tears streaming down his face. "I thought I had time to win it back, to replace it before you found out. But then she got worse, and the market crashed, and I couldn't stop because you'd have known." "I did know." The words cut through his confession like a blade. "I've known for 10 years, Alan." His crying stopped, just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. "What?" Did you really think a police detective wouldn't notice when his wife's financial records didn't match her spending patterns? I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. I've been building a case against you since 2014, gathering evidence, documenting every lie, every forged signature, every dollar you stole while your mother was dying. Alan stared at the phone like it was a bomb. You've been investigating me for 10 years? Long enough to get everything I need for multiple felony convictions. I scrolled through the digital files. Elder financial abuse, identity theft, forgery, wire fraud. Each count carries 5 to 20 years in state prison. He lunged at me then, or tried to. But 74 doesn't mean helpless when you've spent a lifetime staying in shape, and 25 years as a police detective teaches you things about personal protection that most people never learn. Alan hit the coffee table instead of me, sending Victoria's photo albums crashing to the floor. Pictures of our family scattered across the hardwood, birthdays, holidays, graduation days when we'd thought we were raising a good man. You want to know the really sick part? I asked, not moving from my chair as Alan struggled to get up from the floor. She defended you right up until the end. Even when she was rationing her pain medication because she thought we couldn't afford more, she told me what a good son you were, how proud she was of you. Alan crawled backward until his shoulders hit the wall. Blood was running from his nose where he'd hit the table, but he didn't seem to notice. "What do you want?" he whispered. "I want your mother's money back. Every penny." I stood up and looked down at him. "But since you've already lost most of it gambling, I'll settle for justice." The sound of car doors slamming outside made Alan's head snap toward the window. Red and blue lights were painting the walls of my living room in alternating colors. "You called the cops?" "I called Detective Webb. About an hour ago. I walked to the front door as the doorbell rang. Right after I finished uploading 10 years of evidence to the police database. Through the peephole, I could see Marcus Webb standing on my porch with 2 uniformed officers. I opened the door and stepped aside. "Marcus, thank you for coming." "Lucas." He nodded at me, then looked past me into the living room where Alan was still sitting on the floor. "Is that him?" "That's my son." The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. Alan Thompson, age 35, wanted for elder financial abuse, identity theft, and fraud totaling over $40,000. Alan didn't resist when they handcuffed him. He just sat there like a broken doll while Marcus read him his rights. As they walked him past me toward the door, he looked up at my face one last time. "Dad, don't." I cut him off. "You lost the right to call me Dad when you decided your mother's life savings were worth less than your gambling addiction." After they took him away, I sat back down in Victoria's chair and looked at the scattered photos on the floor. 28 years of marriage, 35 years of raising a child, and it all came down to this: an empty house and a thief in handcuffs. I picked up one of the fallen pictures. Victoria holds newborn Alan in the hospital, both of them glowing with joy and possibility. She'd had such hopes for him, such dreams. Maybe it was better that she'd never known what he really was. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of courtroom B, watching my son get sentenced to 15 years in state prison. The judge's words washed over me like distant thunder. Elder financial abuse, identity theft, wire fraud. 5 years for each count, to be served consecutively. Alan had aged a decade in 6 months. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by Orange County Jail uniforms that hung loose on his shrinking frame. When the bailiff led him away in shackles, he turned back once to look at me. I didn't look away, but I didn't acknowledge him either. That part of my life was over. Detective Webb found me in the courthouse parking lot afterward, leaning against my car and watching normal people go about their normal lives. "How are you holding up, Lucas?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the text message that had come in during the sentencing. It was from the Elder Abuse Task Force. "Mr. Thompson, we've identified 2 more families who were targeted by the same scheme. Your evidence helped us build cases against 3 other fake attorneys running similar operations. Thank you. 2 more families, I said, handing Marcus the phone. He read the message and whistled low. Jesus. This was bigger than we thought. Alan wasn't the only one being conned. Jake Mitchell was running this scam on multiple families across 3 states. I watched a young father push his daughter on the swings in the park across the street, testing his system, learning how much he could steal before anyone noticed. Marcus handed my phone back. You saved those families, Lucas, by stopping them when you did. I'd already arranged to meet with the other families, the other sons and daughters, who'd almost lost their parents' life savings to the same con men. They deserved to know what had happened, deserved to understand how close they'd come to losing everything their parents had worked for. Mrs. Henderson was waiting on my front porch when I got home, holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. She'd been doing that for months, showing up with food I didn't want, conversation I didn't need, concern I didn't deserve. "How did it go?" she asked, following me inside without being invited. 15 years in state prison. I set my keys on Victoria's old table and noticed she'd left fresh flowers in the vase. White roses, Victoria's favorites. "I'm sorry, Lucas." Mrs. Henderson set her plate on the kitchen counter and turned to face me. "I know he was your son, but I'm not sorry about the sentence." "Neither am I." She studied my face like she was looking for cracks in a foundation. "Are you sure about that?" I thought about the question while I made coffee neither of us really wanted. Was I sorry? Sorry that Alan would spend 15 years in prison? Sorry that the boy I'd raised had turned into a thief? Sorry that Victoria had died never knowing her son had stolen her life savings? "I'm sorry about a lot of things," I said finally, "but not about justice being served." Mrs. Henderson nodded and lifted the foil from her plate. Chocolate chip cookies, the kind Victoria used to make for Alan when he was little. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so bitter. "The Hendersons next door are moving," she said, settling into Victoria's chair like she belonged there. "Their daughter's taking a job in Seattle. The house goes on the market next week. Good for them. Have you ever thought about moving? Starting fresh somewhere?" I've been thinking about it more and more lately. This house held 30 years of memories, but most of them felt tainted now. Every room where Alan had played as a child was also a room where he'd lived as an adult. Every photo on every wall reminded me of the trust I'd placed in someone who'd betrayed it. "Maybe," I said. "Somewhere Victoria and I always talked about visiting, but never got around to." Mrs. Henderson smiled, and for the first time in months it reached her eyes. She would have liked that. After she left, I walked through my house like I was seeing it for the first time. Victoria's garden was overgrown, her books still marked with bookmarks she'd never remove. Her coffee cup still sat in the cabinet where I'd left it 10 years ago, unwashed and waiting for her to come back from a doctor's appointment she'd never returned from. I pulled out my laptop and started browsing real estate listings in small coastal towns where nobody knew my name or my story. Places where I could be just another retiree walking on the beach instead of the police detective who'd sent his own son to prison for stealing from his dying mother. The doorbell rang as I was looking at a small cottage in Maine with a view of the ocean. I almost didn't answer it. I'd had enough visitors for one day. But something made me walk to the front door and look through the peephole. A woman about my age stood on my porch, holding flowers and wearing the kind of nervous expression people get when they're not sure they should be there. I opened the door. "Mr. Thompson? My name is Carol Manning. My family was one of the ones targeted by the same scheme that almost got you." I stepped aside to let her in, noting how her hands shook as she held the flowers. "How did you find out about it?" "Detective Webb contacted us after Alan's arrest, said our case was connected to yours." Carol sat down on the edge of Victoria's sofa like she was afraid to get comfortable. "We almost lost everything, Mr. Thompson. My father's retirement savings, the money he'd set aside for my mother's medical care. If you hadn't stopped them when you did. I'm glad your family is okay. Mr. Thompson, I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to thank you, not just for stopping them, but for the way you stopped them." She met my eyes directly. You could have just reported Alan quietly. Instead, you built a case that exposed the whole operation. You saved my family, and others we'll probably never even know about. We talked for an hour about her parents, about the other families who'd been targeted, about the long road of recovery that lay ahead for all of them. When she left, she hugged me, a fierce, grateful embrace that caught me off guard. "Your wife would be proud of you," she whispered before letting go. After she was gone, I sat back down at my laptop and clicked on the cottage listing again. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a small garden perfect for someone who wanted to grow vegetables instead of investigating crimes. The kind of place where I could wake up each morning and choose to remember Victoria as she really was, kind, generous, trusting, instead of as Alan's victim. I picked up my phone and called the realtor. But before I could truly move forward, there was one last stop I needed to make. The main state prison sat like a gray fortress against the morning sky, its walls topped with razor wire that caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp, cutting angles. I'd driven 8 hours to get here, making good time on empty highways that seemed to mirror the emptiness I felt inside. Alan had been transferred here 3 months ago, part of the state prison system's way of making sure financial criminals served their time far from the communities they'd damaged. I hadn't planned to see him again, hadn't wanted to, if I was being honest. But something Carol Manning had said kept echoing in my head. Closure isn't just for the living. The visiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Plastic chairs bolted to linoleum floors, vending machines humming in the corner, and families trying to maintain connections across tables designed to keep people apart. I sat in chair number 12 and waited. When they brought Alan in, I almost didn't recognize him. Prison had carved away everything soft about his appearance, leaving behind sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His hair had gone gray at the temples, premature aging that comes from sleeping with one eye open and learning to live with the consequences of your choices. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the scratched metal table. For a full minute, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other across the gulf that had opened between us the night he decided his mother's money was worth more than his family's trust. "You look good, Dad." His voice was quieter than I remembered, roughened by months of keeping his mouth shut and his head down. "Retirement suits you. Don't." I kept my voice level, professional. "You don't get to call me Dad anymore. You don't get to pretend we're a family having a chat." Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or just disappointment that his old manipulation tactics weren't working. "Then why are you here?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Victoria's engagement ring, the one I'd given her 43 years ago when we were both young and believed that love could conquer anything. I set it on the table between us. "She wanted you to have this, for your wife when you find someone to marry." I watched his eyes focus on the ring, saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "She made me promise to give it to you when the time was right. The time was right 15 years ago, before you knew what I'd done. The time is right now, because I'm keeping my promise to her, not to you." I leaned forward slightly. "She believed in you until the very end, Alan. Even when you were stealing from her, she was planning for your future happiness." His hands started shaking on the table. Not the calculated tremor of someone trying to gain sympathy, but the real thing. The kind of shaking that comes from confronting truths you've spent months trying to avoid. "I can't take that." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, you can, because carrying it with you for the rest of your sentence is part of learning to live with what you did." I stood up, leaving the ring box on the table. "Every time you look at it, you'll remember what you threw away. Every time you touch it, you'll know what your greed has cost you." "Dad, please." I said don't call me Dad, but my voice had lost its edge. Looking at him sitting there, broken, hollow, wearing the consequences of his choices like a second skin, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness, never that, but something that might have been a pity. "You were my son once," I said quietly. "Before you became a thief, before you became a liar, before you became someone who could steal from his own dying mother for gambling money. I'm here because that boy deserves to know that he was loved, even if the man he became can never be forgiven." I turned to walk away, but his voice stopped me at the door. "The other families, the ones who almost lost everything, do they know I'm sorry?" I looked back at him one last time, sitting alone at that metal table with his mother's ring box and the weight of his crimes. Sorry doesn't bring back the sleepless nights they spent worrying about their parents' financial security. Sorry doesn't erase the stress you put elderly people through. Sorry doesn't restore your mother's trust. I know that, but do they know? They know you're in prison for 15 years. That's all they need to know. The drive back to my cottage took me through small towns where families were just starting their Saturday mornings, kids on bicycles, parents working in gardens, dogs barking at mailmen. Normal life, the kind I'd forgotten existed during the 10 years I'd spent building a case against my son. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Victoria would have loved. I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the waves roll in, steady and predictable and eternal. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb. "Just wanted you to know, Jake Mitchell was sentenced to 20 years yesterday. Turns out he was running similar cons in 5 states. Your case broke it wide open. Thanks for that." I deleted the message and put my phone away. Jake Mitchell, Alan Thompson, all the other predators who thought they could exploit people's trust and love. They were someone else's problem now. My job was done. That night I carried Victoria's ashes out to the small garden behind my cottage and scattered them among the roses I'd planted in her memory. I told her about the trial, about the other families we'd helped save, about the peace I was finally starting to find. The wind picked up as I was talking, rustling the leaves above my head like she was listening. Maybe she was. Maybe wherever she'd gone she already knew that justice had finally been served, that the man who'd stolen from her was spending years paying for what he'd done. Or maybe it was just the wind, and I was just an old man talking to himself in a quiet garden. Either way, for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I could finally let her rest in peace. If you are connected with this story of justice and starting over, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. To hear another powerful story of family, betrayal, and finding peace, click on the video suggestion on your screen. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away and start fresh.